Welcome this evening. We are super excited to have Dr. Raj and Dr. Deanna Thompson with us. And tonight we are excited to share a little intro to restorative justice and the ability to learn about restorative justice circles and how we can get more involved in that. So we're going to have two different presentations. One with Dr. Raj at the beginning, and feel free if you have questions or comments to use the chat box. We'll be breaking off into breakout rooms with both presentations, so just be aware of that. And then we'll invite Deanna to share her interfaith text study later in the evening to wrap up. So we are so excited that you are all with us today and here to share some learning and some thoughts and feelings on how we can be better in community together. So I'm going to pass it off to our Executive Director, Randy Ross, to do a little introduction. Yeah, we can all, I like the
Come on, y'all. Let's see some action.
You know, it's all interactive. I'm all for that tonight. So Randy, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you very much. Sarah, should I cue this up with John Choi's request for a second? Great.
You are the director.
Okay, I still like to be collaborative. As part of Opportunity St. Paul, we do clergy engagement sessions with many of the clergy from your houses of worship. And one of those was with Ramsey County Attorney John Choi. And John Choi told us in that session just before COVID that it's his goal to divert from the traditional criminal justice system 98.5% of young people who are charged with crimes. He doesn't think they belong in the system. But to be able to divert, he needs to be able to refer them to what we're calling a restorative practice circle, where I'm not even going to say what it is because Raj is going to say what it is. And he said what he'd really like from Interfaith Action is, could we join with the organizations doing good work in this restorative practice space and recruit for them some volunteers from the faith community to join in their work. And so we've spent the summer during COVID distanced trying to get to know the most respected people in the field. All roads point to Raj, who I will introduce in just a moment. And we learned of the great respect also of a group called the Dispute Resolution Center. So we have a small pilot cohort of OSP volunteers in the DRC 9-week training right now. And I'm doing it myself also so that I can have the full experience. And we want our community to start learning how to invest themselves in this important work. We don't think we're going to be in a position to get large numbers of volunteers in, probably for several months. There's training, there's this, there's that. We need to learn how to work together. But tonight is our beginning. And Raj is the academic, clearly, who's most respected in this field. And not just that he's an academic. Everyone you talk to and say, who should I talk to? The first thing they say is Raj. So with that, I'm going to formally introduce Raj and then turn it over to him for the time between now and 8 o'clock. So Dr. Raj, his position at the moment, not that his position defines him, at the moment he is the associate professor at Metropolitan State University. Raj describes himself as a recovering criminologist, an alcoholic, a survivor of sexual abuse, with more than 20 years of community-based activism as a research and educator. He is inspired by the resilience of our youth and by the resilience of the people in our prison systems. He trains school staff, probation agents, community members, and justice personnel on restorative practices, trauma and healing, values-centered leadership, community building, and unpacking implicit biases. Dr. Raj believes in raising consciousness using the restorative circle process. In his latest work, Dr. Raj explores the depths of our justice system and creates a framework in which knowledge and heart become the root of our practices. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Raj.
Wow. I am. I hope I did. I hope I didn't send you that. I'm really hoping that I can live up to it. But thank you, Randy, and thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Deanna, and all of the rest of you here on this frame, right? Because I'm seeing you as this rectangle frame. But I want to invite us to imagine that we are entering into a safe and a brave space, right, today. Because restorative practices is so old, right? It comes from our indigenous traditions, right? So when you think about our indigenous communities, right, and you think about 1492, when that crash landing happened, right, they immediately said there were no people living in these spaces, right? The people who live in these spaces were just a bunch of naked people. We were already creating a narrative about who was living here. And now we know, if you read the book 1491, right, the indigenous authors often say there were about 15 million people spread, right, in these spaces. Right, and you read about Cortez and his men landing in a place called Mexico today, and encountering, right, the chief there, the king there, and realizing, my God, this community is so much more advanced than what we have in Europe. Right, Cortez was commanded by Spanish king and queen, right, while he was in present-day Cuba, right, present-day Cuba, and he brought his warriors and others and landed and encountered Montezuma, right, the then leader of the community that was in Mexico, present-day Mexico, and realized that they had trash picking, they were building buildings on water, right? Such advanced communities. But then when we look at that history, right, 500 years later, we realize that we've been lied to, right? Lied to. 1519, when they landed. 500 years later, 2019, right? We were told all of these myths about this space. And these communities introduced us to restorative practices, right? And if you look at the continent of Africa, right, prior to colonial entry, many of these communities were using what we call restorative practices and circle work, right? So when the county attorney's office in John Choi's office, right, like, oh, we need to do a pilot of how restorative practices work. So I looked at them and I say, you know what? Are you doing a pilot to test your fear or the effectiveness of 500 years of wisdom? Right? If not more. In fact, most of our surveys and our pilots about restorative practices is about our fear, right? We're afraid that people will go through the process and then they will go recommit, right? As if people in our prison systems do not end up in our prison systems. How effective are they? Right? As a practitioner, right? As a recovering criminologist, I know 65 to 70% of the people return to our prison systems. How effective are they? Right? So when people question the integrity, the purpose of this practice, I'm hoping that you will be at least invite them to think about how old this is and what's the wisdom that we bring forth as we look back, right? As we look back. So let us not, right? The St. Paul School District has been trying to do this work. And about 3-4 years ago, a teacher wrote, "Oh, restorative practice is about hug a thug program." Right? She slammed it without really understanding what she's really saying. Right? She was in the moment, in trauma, right? Because of some of the incidents, violent incidents. So she wrote that, but never it is about just hug a thug. We want restorative practices to be led by love, not by fear, right? So the current system, criminal justice, suspensions in schools, right? Housing policies, right? All of them are led by fear. If you don't pay the rent, we're going to kick you out, right? If you don't come to school and behave, we're going to suspend you, right? All of these systems are built and led by fear. What we want to invite you to think about is leading by love. How do you check people with love? How do you check people with faith? Right? So the process that we are talking about is not mine. I didn't make this up, right? I'm simply walking and standing on the shoulders of the many, many elders who have passed this wisdom on to us. So we are all learners in this process, right? So as we begin, I just want to kind of invite you to take a couple of deep breaths, right? Engage your diaphragm, close your eyes if you're comfortable. If you're standing, right, make sure your feet are firmly on the ground. If you're sitting, make sure your feet is firmly on the ground. Sink into your chair, come into this space, right? Breathe deep, engage that diaphragm, let it rise as you breathe in. Hold that breath and then fall as you breathe out. Rise as you breathe in. Hold that breath and let it fall gently. And continue breathing, and I want to share this with you, this document, right? So when we do restorative practices, we often want to start off and circle process work with an acknowledgement, right? Land and enslavement acknowledgement. As you breathe, I'm going to read this to you. I want to acknowledge that no matter where most of us are currently located in the United States, most of us, spend today and every day on land stolen from indigenous people and cultivated by the enslaved community. It is essential to understand the long-standing history that has brought us to reside and benefit from this land, and to seek to understand our place within the history of genocide, history of enslavement, history of settler colonialism, and history of racism. Land and enslavement acknowledgements do not exist in the past tense or historical context. Settler colonialism and white supremacist ideology is a current ongoing and cultural and systemic need. And we need to build the mindfulness of our present participation in the placement of the need. Right, as you come back into this space, I want to invite you to use the chat box just to share what did you hear? How did you feel about this statement? Right, let's take a minute or two. Let's share out. And I'm going to try and keep up reading. Sarah and Deanna, will you, you can also help in reading what people are writing, right? What are your thoughts? How are you feeling, right, about the statement? Right, I have a friend, Edward Villandro, who's in Rosebud, South Dakota, where he's a pretty fixture in St. Paul. He often asks his students, right, what's the first thing you do when you get out the bed in the morning? Right, and most of us will say, I don't know, I check my phone, right, do a little bit of reading, go to the bathroom, right, all kinds of things, right? Does that resonate with y'all? If it does, raise your hands, right? Yeah, get coffee, right? Hug my cat and dog, right, Anna? Right, oh, Chris? Anna's like all sharp looking. She's not even smiling. Okay. So Dr. Edward Villandro often say to people, here's what the first thing you and I do when we get out of our bed in the morning. We step on stolen grounds. That's the first thing we do. Right. So it says, somebody here said, I've never heard some so inclusive about the land that I have occupied all my life. It makes me think deep about needing to learn more about the past. How can we ever restore what has taken people? Yeah. Necessary for us to realize where we are and from whom we stole the land. I've never been in my house when someone has reminded me of this land. The plot of the land where I live is stolen land. Thinking about the stolen land together with the need is staggering. Randy, is that Randy? Randy, do you want to say a few more words about that, Randy? Share with us.
Yeah, I was just, I mean, they're both such tremendously painful, not just images, realities, but putting them together. I hadn't thought of them in one thought until you read that. And it's devastating.
Yeah. Right. Other thoughts? What's cooking for people? Yes, Jill, go ahead.
We've been doing some work at St. John the Evangelist Episcopal Church along the lines of racism, et cetera. And we've also spoken about the indigenous people and the stealing of the land. And I've really learned something about what I'll call corporate responsibility as opposed to individual responsibility. Mm-hmm. So I get to speak for others. We even compared it to the Psalms in the Bible, and how some of the Psalms are laments or thankfulness by individuals, and others are about others, like our neighbors, whoever they are. So we get to say, and we don't have to know everything about what you all have been through. We can within our hearts be empathetic, speak empathetically, And in so doing, I'm beginning to find that I'm becoming connected in a way that I didn't know was possible. So I've often complained, well, I haven't been there. I haven't had firsthand experience. And I'm beginning to find I don't have to worry about that.
Thank you. Thank you, Jill. Right. Somebody said, where does the work of reparation begins? Right. Yeah. I mean, there are all kinds of mathematical ways of doing reparation. Right. Someone said that $100 trillion worth of stuff in the United States. So let's make sure that 14% of that, 15% of that is given to the communities that have had a history of enslavement, right? That's mathematical. Maybe it makes sense, right? Spike Lee said, right? Spike Lee named his movie company, right? 40 Acres and a Mule, right? That's the name of his company, because that was a promise, right? That was made by the people who were led and ended the Civil War, right? So there are all different ways of thinking about reparation. For me, the idea has to start with our values, right? So when you enter into the restorative arena, you're often invited to stay closer to your values and not check your value at the door, right? You're not entering into work, you're entering into hard work, right? Hard work, not hard work, right? When you are entering into a circle, in a restorative circle, you're entering into your heart space. And stay close to your values, right? So I want to invite us to use the framework, right? For those of us who are not familiar, this is the instruction. So if you look at your screen, just your box, and you go to the right-hand corner, right? Right-hand corner, and you see 3 dots, right? You can go to that dot and click on rename, right? And I want to invite you to put your value beside your name. So you can shrink your name to first name and just put your value, right, by your name. Let's see what are the values that show up. Values that are important to you, values that sort of have been a part of your life. And truth, Chris says, right? Respect, right? Truth, Chris, yes. Others. Privilege, Renee say. Can you tell us more about that, Renee? Privileged.
Let's just wait till my phone stops ringing.
Okay, sure. Others. I'm not seeing, where are my values, y'all? Change your name. Yeah.
My phone stopped ringing. I can answer now.
Okay.
Participate in events like this, and I welcome the reminder that I'm on stolen land developed by enslaved people. I more and more cannot separate myself from the knowledge of how much privilege I've been given and that I continue to benefit from every day.
Yeah.
And it's with a great deal of sadness and shame for the history of the people I'm from.
Yeah. Right. Vince say grace. Anna says generosity, right? Empathy, right? Beautiful values, right? Beautiful values. When we do restorative practices work, it is always about getting closer to your values and letting your value, right, help you think about and listen to what am I hearing, right? So when you enter into this work with DRC, right, you're often invited to be in spaces with people who have been charged with whatever through the county or through the city of St. Paul. And my invitation to us when we are in that space is not to think about the rap sheet that's in front of us that tells us what are all the crimes, what's the violation. I want to invite us to think about the harm, right? And somebody said the original harm, stealing the land and enslaving people, hasn't been healed yet. And the people who are coming in front of us through these cases are mostly Black and brown bodies. Right? Mostly Black and brown bodies. And when they're in front of us, they are in our circle via Zoom, in person, right? I want us to be conscious of like, okay, I want to lead with love and values. So I want to listen to their story, not what they did, rather what happened. What was their day, right? On the day that this happened, what was happening in their life? So in a way, the invitation is for us to look down to the roots of the problem versus look up the tree, right? Europeans, right? White supremacist ideology often trains us to look above the ground, right? So when you see depictions, you go to a lot of places, right? I often observe paintings of trees and nature is always up. And if you look at the indigenous wisdom, the African wisdom, they always look at the roots. Right? And restorative practices is about looking at the roots and not just looking at how tall the tree is.
Raj, Claire has a question, or
Yes.
her hand up.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Deanna. Appreciate that. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm glad you were sharing the full point you were sharing. I bumped out a little bit and wanted to just ask a quick question, and it may be for a later time. When I hear someone with authority speaking and talking about Black and brown bodies, it always bumps me out. I guess I'm curious why that is language that I'm hearing a lot recently. I feel like it's descriptive instead of saying people or persons. I'm just cognitively confused because I also learned recently how important it is for us to not objectify and talk about folks' ancestors as slaves, but rather enslaved people or persons. And so then I'm just wondering about that word body, just referring to folks as bodies. Is that because it seems like that's how folks are treated, as just bodies as objects? I'm just not sure why that's so common now to talk about Black and brown bodies.
Right. I mean, if you look at Beltrami County, right, you see the disproportionate number of Native indigenous bodies in the prisons, in the jails. You look at our state system, right? Relatively speaking, we have about 1% indigenous population in the state of Minnesota, right? But if you look at the women's prison, it's 20% of indigenous women. If you look at the state overall prison system, 10%, right? That it's crazy, right? 1% of the population, 10% of the prison population are these indigenous bodies, right? And what are they doing there? So for me, when I say the Black and brown bodies, it's about who is being targeted, right? And systematically harmed. Who experience the need more often, right? So it's not just by law enforcement, but it is by prison systems, policies of housing, right? Educational access, every one of these institutions you think of are putting their knee on the black and brown bodies and necks, right? So it's not about the objectification, it's about the realization of the disproportional contact with law enforcement agencies that these bodies are faced with.
Okay, I think that helps me a little bit. It is just in the nomenclature that I'm confused, and I guess it's because we are embodied, as humans we are embodied, and the bodies are physically in contact with the knee, as you said, or with the force. So thank you for exploring that.
Yeah, no, but I appreciate the question, right? So when you are entering into circles, when you're doing restorative justice work, right, the work that you are doing is to humanize them, right? Is to look at the roots, is to look at the historical harm, is to look at the intergenerational harm, right? And people say, what about the black on black crime, right? And for me, it's a question that people ask because they don't understand the history of this country, right? When you push people through policies of housing, right, redlining, through policies of mass incarceration, right, you have pushed this community to a place where they are in a state of fight, flight, freeze mode, right? And when they come into those restorative circles, they're going to be in that space of fight, flight, freeze mode, right? So when we are in that space, y'all, right, we need to be present with our hearts and help them be present in that space as human beings, not as a rap sheet, right? Not as a rap sheet, right? I often don't read any of these things. I go in there, get to know them, find out what was their day like, right? What happened? And then figure out how we are going to, as community, to help repair the harm, right? Help them reflect, restore their humanity, and then reformation, reforming, right? Which equals to transformation, right? These are the type of work that you will be doing in this, right? And Randy said you all are going through a 9-week process. Really, I mean, all that is very institutional. I don't do it that way, right? I'm like, jump in. You want to be in a circle? Come on, let's do this work, right? Because I don't think there was a curriculum in the native practices. It's nice when you go to St. Olaf, they'll prepare a curriculum for you, right? But so be it, right? I'm not calling anyone out. I'm just calling people in because I think we systematize everything. And if you can bring your heart to this work, you're already on the path of restorative practices, right? It is hard for me to think about faith. I think about spirituality, right? Because in the name of faith, we have done a lot of harm in this country, right? We have okayed genocide. We have okayed lynching, right? When that lynching of the 3 men happened in Duluth, there were 100,000 people lined up to witness that lynching, right? 100,000 people. And the current police chief in Duluth, it was his great-grandmother who accused that 3 young black men who came there for a circus, right, from down south, right? So we have a history, right? So when you are doing this restorative work, you're really involved and engaged in what Brian Stevens often say, it's about changing the narrative, right? Closing the proximity between us and them, right? Quick story. I was sitting in Chanhassen. I don't know if you all know where Chanhassen is, right? Is beside Chaskay, right? Which we call Chaska, right? Chaskay was the name of the one of the 38 who was lynched in Mankato, right? And Chaskay in the Lakota means firstborn male, just like Winona means firstborn female, right? I was sitting in Chanhassen, grading papers, heard conversations about people on summer vacation, 5 houses, 20 boats, and thinking about winter. And I got up, packed my bag. I was driving to North Minneapolis for a restorative circle. Young woman, 14 years old. She comes into the circle. So I said, hey, what happened? She looked at me. She said, I know my mom. We have 5 kids. I know my mom. We can't afford it. So I just wanted to look pretty. I just stole a makeup set, $14. And I was like, immediately went to Chanhassen, right? I'm like, it took me no more than 12 minutes. Y'all, I was speeding, okay? I will take that. I was speeding. Chanhassen to North Minneapolis took me 12 minutes. 12 minutes. And I'm thinking like, wait a minute. How do we do this? How do we end up in such a divide? Why do we live in this zip code mentality? How do we restore that? Because for those of us who know some things about Minnesota history, we know Edina was first developed by the Black community, surveyed and developed by the Black community. The first superintendent was a Black woman. We know that in Falcon Heights, after the killing of Philando Castile, we found out that Falcon Heights original house deeds say you cannot sell the house to Black people. In the deed, that's our history. People struggle with, I can't say Bede Makaska. I'm so used to saying Calhoun. Well, let's change that narrative. Right? Let's change that narrative. Right? So when you do restorative practices, again, underscore that by saying, I want to lead with love. I want to be here present with my heart. I want to do heart work, not hard work, not intellectual work. I want to come in. I want to know your story. I want to know your narrative. I want to close the proximity between you and I. And I want to see your humanity. And once we see that humanity, we can figure out how we're going to do healing work. Right? Prisons don't heal. If you haven't been in a prison, I'll tell you. I walk in and out of prisons, and I'll tell you they don't do healing work. Right? Prisons are a violent place. Prisons are dehumanizing. Strips away your goals, your hopes, and make you dependent on commissary. What am I eating? What kind of shoes am I wearing? Grown men and women fighting over commissary. And we call that rehabilitation. Right? So I'm going to stop and I asked Sarah to help. What do we have? About 24 people. Sarah, we can put them in groups like 6 in each group, right? And make myself a floater, right? And
Yeah.
if Deanna wants to be a floater, let's divide them into about 6 groups, right? 4 groups of 6.
4.
Yeah, 4 groups of 6. 24. I got math.
We can do that.
And then I want to float, and I just want to invite you when you're in your group, in your circle, just share some, what were you listening to? What are you hearing? How are you feeling? Not what you're thinking about, right? How are you feeling, right? And then pick a spokesperson to come back and share in about 5 minutes. One of the things that Annie and Isaac shared, right, I want to just kind of underscore, right? We cannot be thinking about this myth about living in the North, right? We had our share of lynching, right, of Native population, of Black population. We had our share of redlining. We continue to have our share of participation in mass incarceration, police brutality, right? What academia always say, oh, there is an achievement gap. Really, there's no such thing as an achievement gap. There is an opportunity gap in Minnesota, right? It's a lie to say, give people the opportunity, right? As what's the brother's name? He often say, right? Ta-Nehisi Coates say, 8 years we were in power. Right at the end of the Civil War, when funding and opportunity came, the enslaved community rose, right? And then their money was taken away. The Harlem Renaissance that stretched from New York, Harlem to Washington, D.C. brought all kinds of innovation. It stopped, right, 100 years ago, right? Next year, 2021, right? It stopped because in 1921, Tulsa was burned down. Tulsa, Oklahoma was burned down. And that pulled the Black community away from being innovators, driving different patterns, right? So again, think about all of the ways that restoring humanity work is about, right? I want to quickly close with a reading, right? And it says, just do it. The young salesman, right, approached the farmer and began to talk excitedly about the book he was carrying. This book, farmer, will tell you everything you need to know about farming, the young man said enthusiastically. It tells you when to sow and when to reap. It tells you about the weather, what to expect and when to expect it. This book tells you all you need to know. And the farmer smiles and he says, young man, that's not the problem. I know everything that is in that book. My problem is doing it. Our problem is doing it, doing this hard work, right? So with that, I just want to really thank you. And Randy, Sarah, I want another opportunity to come back and keep doing this work, right, with the group. I appreciate all of you. So let us applaud ourselves for being here, and let us remember the values that we are taking with us.
Raj, thank you so much. Thank you. It was wonderful. I've had a lot of my questions answered, and the questions that were asked were very poignant and wonderful. And I agree. I think a continued conversation has to happen. And I love being able to have that with you. So again, thank you, Raj. I would love a copy of that last little bit you just read. Just do it if possible.
Yep.
And we would share it if you give us permission.
Yep. Oh yeah, it's Joseph's work. So yeah, I will put it out there.
That would be wonderful. And folks, as we transition on to our Interfaith Text Study, it is my honor and privilege to invite Deanna Thompson, who has been with us before, to join us and be our Interfaith Text Study leader. She is now the Director of Lutheran Center for Faith, Values, and Community and the Marty Regents Chair in Religion and the Academy. Professor Thompson's work at St. Olaf focuses on advancing the mission and program of the Lutheran Center and promoting interfaith dialogue between both within and beyond St. Olaf. And you may remember Deanna from when she was with us when she was at Hamlin. And so now she's sharing her joys and passions with the community at St. Olaf. So Deanna, you can take it away.
Great, thanks Sarah. Thanks Randy, and thanks Raj. So delighted to be with you tonight and get to meet you in this venue as well. I'm just gonna share my screen and I'm gonna talk for a few minutes about restorative justice in the Bible, and especially in the context of racial reckoning today. So of course we can't go super in depth, but hopefully this will be kind of whetting the appetite for maybe more. So when we think about justice in the Bible, often people think about retributive justice and restorative justice. And what I think is most important from a biblical perspective is to talk about how justice derives from God in a biblical theological context. Justice isn't something that human beings, that we create, but it is an attribute of God, and then we reflect that reality. Justice is understood as the actions that make things right, but in a biblical context, a really important piece is that it's a deeply relational context, or it's a deeper relational kind of idea. So it's not abstract, it's personal, it's relational, it's communal. Another really important point, since this is an interfaith text study, is to talk about how Christians often talk about retributive versus restorative justice. They will talk about it as retributive justice is sort of an Old Testament concept and restorative justice is a New Testament concept. And that's actually wrong and really not helpful and has clear kind of anti-Jewish overtones. So I think it's really important for us to just be clear that the biblical understanding of justice, there is retribution as a part of it. That's in the Hebrew Bible as well as in the New Testament. And restorative justice is in the Hebrew Bible as well as in the New Testament as well. So the God of the Bible has retributive justice attributes and restorative justice attributes. And that's kind of an important piece to bring up. So in terms of retribution, I think the go-to verse biblically would be an eye for an eye, right, in Exodus 21. And one of the things we're talking about when we talk about retributive justice, which I think often this can be, retributive justice can sound harsh. There can be a emphasis on wrath, on judgment. But another kind of way to frame this is that retributive justice takes harm seriously. That when someone does something to someone else that's harmful, that has an effect and that needs repairing, right? Retributive justice often also in a biblical context is proportional. So an eye for an eye doesn't say a life for an eye, right? It is saying that the kind of punishment or kind of what the consequences that come from harm done shouldn't be extraordinarily disproportionate to the kinds of acts that have been carried out that might have been harmful. And I have an example here from Galatians in the New Testament that they're just to kind of illustrate the retributive kind of mindset. If you know, one of the things I think for Christians that would make them think that retribution is more an Old Testament concept and restorative is more a New Testament concept, you have in the New Testament Jesus quoted as saying, like, you've heard an eye for an eye, and I say, right, turn the other cheek. Well, I would encourage you to read some of the parables of Matthew if you want to get serious retribution, right? That people will be thrown out into outer darkness, into the gnashing of teeth. Like, there's some really, like, so just important to kind of clarify that there's not this sort of one testament, other testament neat split. So in terms of restorative justice, there's a focus really on repairing relationships. Relationships have been broken and they need reparation. And so one of the things I'd like us to look at today is a passage actually from the New Testament. And this is from 2 Corinthians. This is a letter from the Apostle Paul to the church at Corinth. And Paul wrote a lot of letters to different churches. And in Corinth, they were having a lot of disagreements. They were having people who were kind of transgressing the norms that the community had set forth. And so this is one passage among a number that we could use in a biblical context to kind of get us thinking about restorative justice. So Paul writes, "But if anyone has caused pain, he has caused it not to me, but to some extent, not to exaggerate it, to all of you. This punishment by the majority is enough for such a person." So there's an acknowledgement of a kind of retribution, right? There's been harm done. There's some consequences for the harm. "So now instead you should forgive and console him, so that he may not be overwhelmed by excessive sorrow. So I urge you to reaffirm your love for him. And we do this so that we may not be outwitted by Satan, for we are not ignorant of his designs." So there's a corporate dimension here of restorative justice, right? That this person has transgressed the norms of the community. There's some consequences for that, but now Paul is saying what needs to be done is a kind of repairing of the relationship and a repairing and bringing him back into the community, right? And that, Satan here, or the devil, or the temptation to continue harm, that's a threat, right? And how do we stop the harm? How do we start to repair the breach? And what I'd like to do tonight is to pair this passage from Paul with a passage from a book that I'm reading right now. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Rosella. She is actually from the Twin Cities, and she's theologically trained, has been a youth director and a leader in various congregations around the Twin Cities and other places, and now has written this book, Love Big, The Power of Revolutionary Relationships to Heal the World, and sees herself as a coach for self-care, for overcoming self-hatred, and trying to kind of restore relationships also in racially charged contexts. So this is a passage from early on in her book that I think might challenge our view of 2 Corinthians. So she writes about reconciliation. True reconciliation requires facing hard truths head on and giving back what was taken from Black and Indigenous people. Honoring the labor that built this country and created generational wealth for white Americans. Any other starting point is bullshit and doesn't honor the very people you want to be in relationship with. And this part, I think, is the kicker, right? As a Black woman, I can't name a time when people of color were in life-giving, reciprocal, and uplifting relationships with our white counterparts. This time has never existed. yet we talk about being reconciled as if there's a former reality that we can recreate. And I think one of the challenges for all of us, for people of faith, for white Christians, is this talk about restoration, restoring. There's a sense in which there was something, there was a sense of community, there was a sense of connection that was lost and now needs to be repaired. Or reconciliation, there was a relationship that has now been broken and needs to be repaired. What happens when we're in a situation, as Haiti White suggests, that there's never been a time where there's been true community? What do we do then? And so what I would love to have us do, some of you may have seen at the George Floyd Memorial, this billboard that went up not that long ago. So it has a passage from Luke. Someone touched me. I know that power has gone out of me, said Jesus. From John, can any of you prove me guilty of sin? Jesus again, and then a quote from George Floyd, which they're listing here as George 8:46, I can't breathe, mama. And so how do we take this biblical concept of restorative justice that is kind of revealed in this passage and put it next to Haiti White's observation?
Deanna, your voice is all cracked up.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. Deanna, should we break into small
She's
groups?
frozen.
Yeah, she's frozen.
Oh no, she's coming back.
Oh, she's coming back?
Yep. Can you hear us, Deanna?
Raj, I got you. Deanna's a little frozen.
Yeah.
Why don't we sent out a PDF with these questions and the quote from Love Big. And I think what we'll do is go into some small groups and talk a little bit about those 3 questions.
Yeah.
And we'll work on getting Deanna back
to sign out and sign back.
Yeah.
In.
And I'm going to put the questions in the chat. I will do that as well. She has moved over. Here are the questions to everyone, and then I will move you guys into breakout rooms for a little bit. Welcome back, everyone. Beautiful. So Deanna, I'll let you take it over.
Yeah, so we don't have much time, but interested in maybe 1 or 2 responses from what you focused on in your groups. Anything that you think would be helpful or good to bring back to the bigger group for us to consider.
And feel free just to unmute yourself and share.
I guess our group talked, hopefully somebody in it will chime in if I've got this wrong. But our group talked about the necessity of our being, one metaphor was the hands and feet of God doing her work on earth.
Mm-hmm.
That we are all created by God, and therefore God is very present in what, these are my words now, present in what we're doing in this area. And maybe somebody else will add to that was in my group.
Yeah, and I think, from a biblical perspective, all of us are connected, all of us are created in the image of God. And one of our biggest challenges is that we have lived and created systems that denies that reality, right?
Yeah, practically since the Old Testament times. I just finished reading Kings, and how many kings, and they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. On and on and on again.
Yeah, it wasn't practically really since the biblical, it was since the biblical time.
Yeah, right.
And before. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, you know, one of the things that Deanna is talking about, what in South Africa, they say, right, Ubuntu, right?
Yes.
Be able to see, right? When I see you, I can see my humanity in you, and you are able to see your humanity in me.
Yeah.
And in so many different cultures, when they do the namaste, and I love when yoga instructors do the namaste, I'm like, please stop. But, you know, nevertheless, namaste, that is about, I can see the God in you, and
Right.
you can see the God in me.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There are all of these terms that we all use, right? That preaches that
Mm-hmm.
is part of the value.
Right.
Nelson Mandela promoted that word a lot. Yeah.
Mm. Right. It's affirmed across the world in all sorts of cultures and religions.
Mm-hmm.
And we have lived as if it were not the case.
Mm-hmm.
We spoke about, we liked what the author had to say in Love Big about what if this could be a starting place? What if we don't have to look back and lament over what we did wrong? What if we can move forward? That's kind of freeing. It gives us a space to come from. So that was very helpful. Thank you, Deanna, for that.
Yeah, and I would say from what I've been reading in her book, I'm not sure if she wants to not look at the past, but not also, I think she's wanting to kind of be really realistic about our starting point, that we're not trying to reclaim a time where we were all really connected. So we're not repairing a breach that has been recently put there. And if we're honest about that, what do we do in light of that reality?
Right. Let me underscore that. I think an elder, a restorative justice elder in Oakland often reminds us, right? She said, guilt and shame are like book covers. Mm-hmm. And the function of book covers is to shut you down, right? What we want to invite you to do is tear those book covers, right? And own our past, right? And the principle of Sankofa principle that comes out of the Akan people in Ghana, they often say, you can move forward as long as you know where you came from, right? And we have these pictures of ego moving forward, not looking back. In the Sankofa principle, they say the bird is symbolized by looking back as it moves forward, right? I want to invite you to think about, we got to remember the original harm if we are going to move forward. 400 years later, we are still asking the same question, right? It's time for us to stop.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm going to try and jump in here. The imagery that has been powerful for me during this discussion is the creation story of chaos being separated into creation, and realizing that we are off, every day is a new chaos and a new creation. And what we need to do is be aware that we are surrounded by chaos, and we are to create again anew, and that way we don't ever have to go back to repristinate what never was there. But that imagery of creating out of chaos seems to be helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to just slowly, I apologize if you hear my dogs barking in the background. Something must have gotten their attention and it wasn't me. I would like just to say thank you once again to Raj and Deanna. I think tonight was just really deep and profound, and I just, I could go for another couple hours, but we got to be respectful of everyone's time. So with that, I want to share that if you want to dig deeper into restorative justice practices, reach out to myself, Randy. We'll get you in touch with Raj, and we're slowly building this group of folks who's working with Dispute Resolution Center in St. Paul and working on getting some circles together for many, many different places, different situations, and meeting people who want to do the heart work. And I love that phrase, the heart work, which is hard work as well. So again, thank you, folks. We appreciate your time. We will have our next learning event coming up in September. If you're interested in learning more about Opportunity St. Paul, restorative justice practice, interfaith action, reach out to myself or Randy and we will get in touch with you. But as of right now, we're going to sign off and say thank you again and good night.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Raj. We always appreciate it.
Thank you.
Stay in
Thank
touch.
you.
Yep.